All right, welcome. Thank you all so much for being here. My name is Rachel Martin. I'm the Executive Director of the Sheff Movement Coalition. I will be very brief because I want to be mindful of everyone's time and jump into the really good stuff. Can everyone hear me in the back? Not super well. Yes, some say yes, some say no. Okay. I don't know if we want to do mics. We'll try to see if we can just have our panel kind of enunciate. If you can't hear, feel free to kind of come a little bit closer and move your chairs out. So welcome, everyone. Thank you for being here this morning. I am going to be very quick and just do a couple brief housekeeping announcements. First of all, restrooms, very important if you need to use it. Out the front doors here and to your right are restrooms, so feel free to use those. And there are refreshments in the back. I want to recognize a couple folks that are here today that helped to make this wonderful event possible. I'm so excited to have this panel here and to see what kind of conversation happens around integration in our communities. So first of all, I want to recognize our Sheff Movement Coalition board members. If you are here and can just raise your hands. Thank you so much for your support. Thank you. Our co-chair, Elizabeth Sheff, is here on the panel. We also have our co-chair, Jim Boucher, in the back, who will speak to you a little bit later about some of our legislative efforts at the end of this session. So please, if you're able to hold on till that, we would appreciate that. Really briefly, if you will. Just bear with me. Whenever I do a public event, I think it's really important to recognize that the space that we're in and the land that we stand on was once occupied and is the ancestral land of indigenous peoples here in Connecticut, and I think it's important to recognize that. So I just want to acknowledge publicly that we are here today on the ancestral land of the Nipmucs, the Sequin tribes, and the Mattabesic and the Pequot Mohegan tribes. Without the colonization of which we would not be here. So making sure that we acknowledge that, I think is important. I also want to recognize that we have some amazing teams here today from some schools. We are working with, they are school-based advocacy teams. We have students, parents, and educators here today that we're working with some of these folks a little later on to build some skills around equity and education, to talk about race and how it impacts education, and to build some advocacy skills and put together some action items and things that they can work on to improve their educational climate and the environment in their schools. And so we have students here from Academy of Aerospace and Engineering. We have groups here from Breakthrough South Magnet School, and we have the District of West Hartford. So I just want to recognize that they're here and thank them for being here. Yeah. Thank you all. And because this is who it's all about, right? The students. That's what we're here for. And so we're really excited to engage their voice in this conversation. It's very important. And so with that, I'm going to hand it over to principals. Are there any principals here today from Magnet Schools? Yes, a couple? So great, thank you.
Yes,
so I'm going to hand it over to our moderator, Zaps from Integrate NYC, who will kind of take it from here.
Thank you, Rachel. Hello, everyone. My name is Zaps. Hi. Hey. Good morning. It's really a pleasure to be with you here today. And a big thank you to all of you for showing up this morning. I think it's really an important thing to have an engaged community, and to know that you all took your time this morning to be here just says a lot about how you feel about your roles. And I think in the world of being a civically engaged person, we often focus on voting, but it's actually all the days in between that really amount to the experience that we have in our communities. So it's a pleasure to be with you all. And just to go a little bit more into the who's in the room, we brought a little tool that we like to use called Menti. So if you go on your internet connected device to menti.com and you put in this code 844223, you can then select as many of these things as describe you. So if you're an educator and a parent, that's okay. Select them both. We want to know who's in the room with us. All right, great. We've got some parents and advocates, community members, students.
What's the, how do you on here? Do you have a,
Oh, yeah, Wi-Fi password. Oh, the Wi-Fi password would be great. Thanks, Rachel.
Yes. So the network name is NP Center.
NP Center is the network name, and password
NPC Guest.
NPC Guest. All.
The N, the P, the C, and the G are capitalized.
The N, the P, the C, and the G are capitalized. Okay, great. Look at this. It's beautiful. We've got 32 folks who can put their answers in. A lot of community members, a lot of advocates. Shout out to the policymaker for being in community. It's beautiful. Students, big work for the students. Okay, beautiful. And we're actually this tool is going to help us later also after the panel to support you in understanding next steps and how you might want to get involved. So keep your phone handy. So I would love to start just by getting everybody on the panel to be able to introduce themselves to you, now that we know a little bit about who you all are. And the way we're going to do this is you're just going to say your name, the pronouns you use, what role and work you do, how you came to this work, and why integration matters. Okay? So my name is Zax. She, her, hers are the pronouns that I use. I am the Executive Adult Director at Integrate NYC, a youth-led organization. And there's a lot of ways to tell the story about how I came to this work, but I think I'm going to go with two. So I was working in a school on the Lower East Side, and my role at that school was to support young people putting their passions into action. So the idea was, what do you care about? What matters to you? How can we get you into action around that right now? And I loved doing that work. And what I saw time and time again was that my students' brilliance was often curtailed by the structures that they were in, right? That the school that they were in did not have the resources to support their vision. That the things that they wanted to work on, like getting more sports teams, was something that schools down the road already had. And it started to really get under my skin, that these brilliant, hilarious young people were needing to create solutions for things that kids down the block didn't have to create solutions for. And so that started my inquiry into this work, and that's how I actually found Integrate NYC, founded by students in the South Bronx with their educator. And they were doing that work. They were saying, we are going to be the problem solvers, but we're not just going to solve the problem we see in our lives or in our schools, but the issues we see across this school system of 1.1 million students. And so that's like how I kind of got to the organization. But I think the thing that motivates me on a daily basis, and this is really what connects for me about why integration matters, is that I go by the name Zax, but my given name is Sarah. It's the name of my great-grandmother on my father's side. And she was a mother to two in Belarus. And she actually became a pharmacist. And it was very rare at that time for a woman to have a role of being a pharmacist. She spoke multiple languages. And when she went to school, she was actually forced to stand in the back of her classes because she was Jewish. And 10 years later, she was shot and killed and buried in a mass grave that we have no idea where she is. So for me, what it looks like, what integration really means, is about fighting against these structures that separate us from power, and that actually create the kind of divisions that become dangerous. So I'm going to ask each and every one of you to share your name, your pronoun, what organization you're with, what you do, how you got there, and why integration matters.
I might have to ask you to.
I'm here.
Okay, yeah. Hi, good morning. I'm Sasha Davis. She, her, hers. I am the community organizer for Sheff. I'm also a student at UConn School of NEAG for working on my PhD. What brought me to this work is, I'd like to say, started long before I had my daughter, but the passion was absolutely driven because of her. So I would say I'm a parent on this panel because when I was in high school, I grew up in Wilmington. My school was a top school in the state, so we had resources. Like I did archery and gym and golf, and I thought everyone did those things at school. And when I left that area and I went to college, and I was able to see not everyone had those opportunities, I was like, why? So when it was time for my daughter to go to school, I was just shocked beyond belief to see and recognize that not everybody had those resources and opportunities, and I just didn't understand how and why in a state so wealthy that is, and no one seems to really want to fix the problem. And so I started to work with parents and other community members across the state doing community organizing work to try and rectify that. We worked around school financing because we thought, oh, you just keep throwing money at the problem, and you start to recognize that it's not just money, it's other policies that are working against the system to try and continue to keep communities in poverty on purpose. So you have to work to purposefully integrate communities, and that's the work that I want to work on, which is why I decided to go to school so that I could help create legislation that will change and integrate communities in a way that everyone's child can flourish like my daughter does. So.
Good morning. My name is Francis Rosencourt. I currently serve as the Chief of Staff for Integrate NYC, and I'm a student at the City College of New York where I study political science. My gender pronouns are he and his. How I came into this work, I attended a high school in Brooklyn, in the Brooklyn part of New York City. That was also a very well-funded high school. There were a lot of opportunities. It was one of those high schools that if you had a screen, so if you had good grades, which I was fortunate enough to have, you'd be let into the school. And as you can tell, what a screen and quote-unquote good school looked like, demographics were very not diverse. It was very small group of students of color. There were probably around 10 kids of color in my graduating class, of them being guys. There were around 4 of us. And in that school, there were many instances of school segregation, not just due to the lack of students of color, but also small interactions in the hallways with administration, in the classrooms. And I really understood what those interactions was and what I was dealing with after I was able to go to school exchange with another school in the Bronx. And from there, I was able to see firsthand how 2 schools in the same city could really be so different in good ways and in a lot of bad ways. I was able to see how, despite two schools being in the same city, there were different resources in terms of sports teams, in terms of pitching equipment, in terms of just basic things in the classroom. You know, I was used to having a cart of MacBooks in my classroom and projectors and a plethora of educational opportunities, but in the same city, there are students that look like me that have access to maybe a handful of sports teams and still have projectors, and their kitchen equipment only consists of, let's say, a large microwave, where I was fortunate enough to have large salad bars and a whole bunch of food options. And one of the crazy things is that the only reason why I was even afforded this opportunity was because I was deemed a quote-unquote good student, and the measures were only a test, right, and academic scores. So not only was I provided this privilege, but it wasn't even based on something that was truly reflective, right? But that's kind of how I had my eyes open to this issue and how I got involved with Integrate NYC a couple years later. And to me, integration matters because all students deserve an equitable education, but also an education that truly values them and puts them at the center of the conversation. A lot of times students go to school and they don't really necessarily feel valued or feel that their voices matter, that they can somehow influence their school, even though they are the main parts of the school. I mean, the school exists for students, right? That's why we're all here at the end of the day. So that's something that really pushed me to do this work, because I believe that students should have more voice in their schools, and that decisions being made that affected them, they should be at the center of that conversation. They should have influence in that conversation. And if schools are inequitable and schools are going through such a wide range of issues in terms of who has opportunities and who doesn't, then students should be at the forefront of fighting for what they deserve. Because at the end of the day, all these decisions and all these byproducts of school segregation affect them firsthand.
Elizabeth Gordon Sheff. We. It is 30 years coming up, 3 decades strong that I have been a social justice advocate for quality integrated education. But I've also advocated for grandparents raising grandchildren, people who are affected by HIV/AIDS, housing, diversity, the list goes on. My commitment to diversity springs from my faith. I believe that we have a responsibility to one another, regardless of your race, your class, or ethnicity, to promote the good of the whole. And that's my mother. I grew up in Charter Oak Terrace. You may now know that as the Walmart Plaza. But in that time and space in my life, I grew up with people of all different racial, ethnic backgrounds. And my mother taught me people are people. And she also taught me that we have a responsibility to others and not just to ourselves. Integration matters because we are in a country that is growing more and more colored. We live in a country where if we fail to prepare all students to work, produce, laugh, fight, cry, celebrate together, then we undermine the future of our nation. So I've been at this, like I said, for a while now. And in this room, I see many people who have been on the road with me this long time, ergo we. I would like to take a moment to recognize those people because they have become part of my family. So in this room, we have named plaintiffs in Sheff versus O'Neill, and I'm going to call you out. There's Eugene, Dr. Eugene Leach, Tom and Carol Vinnick are here, and my dear friend, for 30 years now, Martha Stone, who is one of our original lawyers. 30 years, Martha. 30 years. And of course, Dennis Parker, who's been here, gone, came back.
Couldn't stay away.
Yeah. So I'm looking forward to our discussion this morning.
Good morning. Thank you all for coming, and thank you for inviting me. My name is Dennis Parker. He, his, him. And I am the director of the ACLU's Racial Justice Program. My interest and advocacy for inclusion and diversity and integration is both personal and professional. I have for now almost 4 decades practiced public interest law in a number of different areas for the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, the Legal Aid Society in New York, the Civil Rights Bureau of the New York Attorney General, and now the ACLU, where I am working. And in the course of that work, I've gotten the chance to see the difference in opportunities that are given for people of color and whites in the United States. At the Legal Defense Fund, I coordinated the 300 school desegregation cases, most in the South, and I'll talk about that when I speak, but 2 of them in the North, one in Denver, Colorado, and one in Hartford, Connecticut, and saw in the course of that work the amazing disparities between opportunities for students, and learned that this work is not about pulling students up, but of not blocking them, because what I saw in my experience were talented, gifted children who just were not given the opportunity and who were prevented by all sorts of policies that made it impossible for them to achieve their potential and for us to all benefit from that achievement. And so that is one of the things that has kept me. I'm relatively recent. I've only been working on Sheff for 25 years.
Baby.
But it is something that I am extremely devoted to. And personally, I grew up in Mount Vernon, New York, which is in Westchester County, and so you think, oh, you know, you probably had gold-plated schools and things, but if you know Mount Vernon, it is, in addition to being the home of many of the greatest rappers, of which I'm not one, it is a low-income city that more closely resembles the Bronx than it does the rest of Westchester. I, through a series of accidents, had an opportunity to go to exceptional schools outside of the Mount Vernon schools, and to the extent I've enjoyed any success, it was because of those opportunities. I don't fool myself into thinking that I'm anything special in terms of intellect or talent, because I know people who were smarter than me and more talented than me, whose life outcomes were considerably worse than mine. And each one of those is lost potential, is lost opportunity, and is fundamentally unfair, because the fact that I stumbled into opportunity should not be the reason why I enjoy success. And I think that's what motivates all of us in the work that we're doing. We want to make sure that everyone gets a chance to achieve their potential. So I'm excited to be here, excited for this discussion, and excited for the future.
All right, good morning. My name is Erin Boggs. I'm the Executive Director of Open Communities Alliance, which is a 5-year-old civil rights nonprofit here in Hartford. We work with an urban-suburban interracial coalition to advance policies that create access to opportunity, and we really zero in on the location of affordable housing opportunities as a big part of that. And we partner with a lot of organizations that are focused on bringing opportunities to areas that are struggling, which is critical, and we try to do the other piece of the other side of the coin and create access to areas that are already thriving. I forgot to say, etc. And I got to this work, and I should say, I came up through the ACLU here in Connecticut. That was my first job here in the state. So I had some exposure to Sheff, although I was kept away from it because it was a real time suck. I got to this work really because my parents were in the civil rights movement when I was a kid. My dad is a civil rights lawyer, was with the Washington Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights for 47 years. And my parents sent us to the DC public schools. And my graduating class was 80% kids of color. And it allowed me to see the sort of beauty and promise of diversity coming out of school with a diverse group of friends. It also, you saw me next to Dennis here, like shaking my head when he said he wasn't anything special, which wasn't that he's not anything special, but I saw exactly what he was talking about in school, where there were lots of kids with incredible promise that really had barriers in front of them to meet, to reach that promise. And I was also struck in school by, and this is something in a way I realized later, just how different our public schools, and this was the best public school in the city, how different it was from other schools in the suburbs and private schools also nearby in DC. And I was struck in Susan Eaton's Children in Room E4 book. In reading it, there's a description of kids in the cafeteria and how really the custodians, if I recall correctly, are disciplining the kids and trying to keep them in line using, really sort of harsh and abusive techniques. And Susan, in writing this, was just horrified in witnessing this. And it wasn't until I read that I was like, oh, isn't what happens all the time? Like, that's what it was. And that's the way the cafeterias it was. Isn't that the way it's supposed to be? And I think there's an element to being in something and not realizing it could be different. That's a lot of what's going on here, too. So why I think this is important, I think segregation limits choices. I think it creates isolation from opportunity. And I also think it fundamentally undermines our democracy. And I think part of what we're seeing today is a politics of division that cuts off a lot of people with power from the issues that are affecting a lot of people who need help. So you think about DACA, you think about mass incarceration. You have large swaths of Connecticut where these issues are never come up. Like they are not an issue in everyday life for a lot of people, and a lot of those people are the ones who are within the power structure of the state. So, thank you.
All right, good morning, everyone. I'm Robert Cotto. Let's see, pronouns, he, his. And then just in terms of like who I am, I'm a doctoral student at the Nyesha School of Education. I'm a lecturer in Ed Studies at Trinity College. I'm a parent of a 2-year-old looking at schools, pre-K-3. The whole lottery thing just began, so I'm in that seat right now. And I used to be on the Hartford School Board. Just in terms of how I got to this work, I want to maybe separate my comments, with this comment being put my history hat on, like my student of history. I think it'd be presumptuous to say I'm a historian of education, but that's kind of what I like to read about and study. And then in the next set of comments, maybe talk about where we're at now. So just to start out, we had an event earlier this week, and it began with, it was at the Liberal Arts Action Lab at downtown Hartford Constitution Plaza. And at the event, the lead plaintiff for the Robinson case, LaShawn Robinson, asked me, Robert, why do you like magnet schools so much? And how would you feel if your kid didn't get into a magnet school? I didn't get to the second question because they cut me off because I ran out of time. But the first question, I tried to answer it, and I want to answer it a little bit here today to give you guys a kind of a historical background really quick. 1 minute take. And this is based on a chapter that I'm working on with Jack Doherty on the Line book. Jack Doherty is a professor of educational studies at Trinity College. Who's here? He's right there. He's hiding out behind the post there. So they asked me why do I like magnet schools so much? And I think I want to take a step back. And I said, look, number one, I believe all schools should be high quality. The people who wanted magnet schools, the people who believed in school segregation, Sheff, people before her and before the plaintiffs believed in quality education in all schools. That's a given, right? So moving forward, why did they like magnet schools? We have to actually take a little step back even before the Sheff case. And you have to look at who designed and why did they design these things, right? And go back to mid-70s. And what was happening at the time in Hartford, Connecticut was that there was a program called Project Concern, which many of you know now today as Open Choice, right? And what was happening is that there were more and more students going to Project Concern, and there were particularly black folks that were saying, is that integration, right? Or is that one-way integration? Is that making black kids go to the suburbs, right, at their inconvenience? And it never asked anything of white people to do anything, right, besides take a handful of kids in, right? And so you had a bunch of leaders, superintendents at the time, other activists, people were saying, well, maybe this needs to be two-way integration, and kids need to come into the city as well, particularly white kids, right, and also middle-class kids of color. And they saw magnet schools as a way to do that. They saw magnet schools as a way that, even though they were like at their pilot stage, like the art school was actually in a pilot stage right now, they said, maybe these tools, these structures, these magnet schools can have a two-way integration, and you can realize like this, you can bring kids together, which they called kind of numerical desegregation. And on top of that, you can have integration, which asks people to come together on an equal footing, right? Equal status of races, and learning from each other, back and forth. So it's not just what black kids and Puerto Rican kids going to the suburbs and assimilating and being more white. It was a two-way street. And that's kind of how they viewed it. And they saw magnet schools as a way to do that, as a tool to do that. They didn't say magnet schools should be the only thing. They actually believed quality schools that were black and Puerto Rican should also exist as well. But they said that this particular tool could provide that integration and, perhaps more importantly, create a mechanism to bring white people's interests in line and together with black and Puerto Rican interests as well. Because at the time, Hartford couldn't afford books and pencils. This is 1975, 1976. Couldn't afford pencils, couldn't afford books, literally falling apart and on its own. This was before we had educational cost sharing grants. This is before we had the state school funding in the way that it's structured today. And so the people were back there saying, how can we bring these interests together? Because right now, white folks don't have to do anything, right? And they can keep taking our kids through Project Concern and taking our money, maybe more importantly, and Hartford doesn't get anything out of it. And so when we say integration matters, I want to be very clear. There's numerical segregation, right? We bring bodies together. But then it's like integration, right? Where we're saying, are the kids in the places that we have them together learning from each other? Is it a two-way street? Are they on equal status? Those are the sorts of questions I want to kind of move into today in my next part, which is like, what's going on today. So thank you.
If you heard anything that you liked, anything from any of our panelists, then yeah.
Thank you. I think I'm going to keep this one, and if maybe we can pass that one around. So I'm actually going to ask each of the panelists a specific question to kind of try to dig into some of this a little bit more deeply. So I'd love to actually start, Aaron, maybe can you give us a little bit of the history of housing segregation and how that's impacted communities in Connecticut? And I'm going to pull up your presentation.
Okay, great. Well, and really, before this is working, right? Yeah? Okay. Before I get into this, what's really important to mention is that I shamelessly steal from Jack Doherty as part of this. So, I need to just make that clear before I even start. So is there a way for me to be able to forward it? I think I'll go faster if I can do that. And I am going to do the short version here and speed through this because I have a really strong feeling that a lot of people in this room know a lot of this stuff. So I'm going to do the fast version. So part of the question, one of the things that Jack looks at closely in his book On the Line that he's put together with students and others is this change in the Hartford region. How did Hartford go from being the financial capital, from being a cultural center way back in the 1870s to a place that was really one of the poorest countries in the poorest cities in the country today. And so this is mapping that he has pulled together, looking at racial change since he starts at 1900, but I just pulled up the 1950 since that's when you start to see this. The darker the shading, the higher the percentage of people of color. You can see that north of Hartford, in more rural areas, there is some shading there. That's a lot of tobacco farms and other farming work and some manufacturing going on up there. 1980, 2010. So you see that big switch. He also has mapping that looks at home prices during the same eras, and it's the opposite map. So home prices started out, the most expensive homes are in Hartford, and then that moved out to the suburbs. And obviously we know there's a whole history in terms of federal action on highways and all kinds of other things going on at the same time. But I'm just going to flag two things. One is racial covenants. And these are sort of parts of deeds that restrict who can live in housing. And these were deemed by the Supreme Court as something they wouldn't enforce starting in 1948. But technically they didn't become illegal until the Federal Fair Housing Act passed in 1968. Jack and his students actually found some of the racial covenants from around this area. This is one from High Ledge Homes in West Hartford, which is a housing series of houses in a housing development. And the language that is perhaps of concern is no person of any race except the white race shall use or occupy any building on any lot except that this covenant shall not prevent occupancy by domestic servants of a different race employed by an owner or tenant. So it's real. That was West Hartford. That 1940. Real. It's and the legacy of this goes way beyond when you find them in documents. It was just this is the practice that was actually happening in real life for decades after this, and in some ways today still. So the governmental role in this was that they were enforcing the contracts in court. So the government was involved. They knew what was going on. It was about race, and they were supporting it. So another example, and I think zoning is at the heart of a lot of what's going on here. So even though I'm going to talk about a legal case from 1926 and about zoning, I think it's really important. Euclid v. Ambler was the case that basically said, yes, towns everywhere all around the country, you have control over zoning. You are allowed to say the residential area is here, the commercial area is here. We can have 1 acre lots here and 5 acre lots here. And even though zoning is actually a state power that's delegated to towns, the Supreme Court said, yes, towns, you can make those kinds of distinctions. And the premise really now, when we think about zoning and different things like that, it usually comes back to sort of a health and safety concern. But in fact, in this case, in the lower court decision, what the district court said is the blighting of property values and the congesting of population whenever the colored or certain foreign races invade a residential section are so well known as to be within the judicial cognizance. That means, like, we know this, so, you can just assume this whenever you are dealing with these kinds of situations. So this is a case is Euclid v. zoning. The kind of zoning that is used almost everywhere in the United States right now is called Euclidean zoning because of this case. So this background with very clear and intentional understanding of how we were keeping people separate is what was defining our what's going on in our geography. And I want to just zip through what's something that just really has happened right next door. This is in Glastonbury, where I live. And I just want to run through a brief history. In 1966, Glastonbury rejected busing students in. In 1977, they were actually, they were acting on this housing bias. They had residency preferences within a lot of their programs. So you had to live in town to get access to certain housing programs. 1978, HUD refused to approve, I think it's community development block grant money because of they weren't doing they were not allowing affordable housing. So then 1979, they rejected a zoning plan for affordable housing units and Glastonbury pulled their grant application to the federal government for money because it came with an obligation to do stuff on affordable housing and affirmative and furthering fair housing. The government sued Glastonbury for a housing bias. The case is U.S. versus Glastonbury, and one of the attorneys on the case was someone you might have heard of, Dick Blumenthal. On the right side, the correct side of the case. Then 1999, the Christian Activities Council case was actually lost. This was an effort by Glastonbury to keep more affordable housing out. Some of the problematic parts of this case were rectified later through legislation. But my point is that there's a whole history, and you could do this for town after town in Connecticut. And so that, in the most succinct nutshell that I can present, is how we got here today.
Thank you for that. I think, really connecting this question of who we value and how we demonstrate that value, or who we don't value and how we demonstrate that through these racist policies, and then actually looking at what does it mean to rectify that, and not just lay an equal system on top of that, but to lay something that actually restores the harm that has been done. And I'm curious, Dennis, if maybe you can talk a little bit about how this housing policy has intersected with schools, and what that has looked like in Hartford, and how that connects to the Sheff case, and why you became a part of it to begin with.
Thank you, yes. I teach a course on public policy and social change for law students, and when we get to the section on school desegregation, the first question I ask them is, what are the most segregated schools in the United States today? And they usually list schools in Alabama and Mississippi and Georgia, and then are shocked when they hear it's New York City. And they're shocked because we are accustomed to thinking that discrimination is a Southern phenomenon and not one that comes from the North. Professor Gary Orfield, who has worked extensively with us and will continue to in the Stephanie O'Neill case, has documented patterns of segregation in the United States. And he's found that the greatest period of integration was basically between 1968 and 1988. And that was when the schools in the United States were most integrated. And they were integrated because the 300 and more cases that I described before took place then. And they were directed at the school districts in the South, the ones that my students think of. Because in the South, you had a law that required that schools be segregated by race. You had a target that was legally vulnerable, and it made it easier, and that forced these school districts to achieve some desegregation. What has happened since is starting in the late 80s and early 90s, those cases were dismissed, and the Southern schools started to become more segregated, started to look more like the schools in the North. Now, the fact is, over that time period, integration didn't change in the North. It stayed the same, and in some places got worse, because we are becoming a society that is divided. And I just want to make one thing clear. In Alabama, there was a law that said people of different races could not attend the same schools. The segregation in the Alabama schools was not really different than the segregation that exists in schools in New York and in other northern states. And the reason is that it was a little harder to put your finger on, but those things that Erin described were as much the cause of segregation as those laws in Alabama. The one exception in Professor Orfield's study of northern states, and he's done a state-by-state examination. You could take a look at the Civil Rights Project at UCLA to get a sense of how each state is doing. The one state that is the exception to the other northern states is Connecticut, where he said that there were steps being taken to address the patterns of integration. He identifies the cause for Connecticut being different from the other states. And the cause is the case that Martha and the plaintiffs brought 30 years ago, is Sheff v. O'Neill. And I think it's very important that we take time, particularly now when there are challenges involving the case, to look at it in the proper perspective, to recognize the conditions that existed. You'll be hearing more about that in Hartford at the time the case was brought 30 years ago. The way that there have been changes, not nearly enough, but there have been changes since the Supreme Court decided the opinion in 1996 and ordered the state to address the segregation that existed. The fact that there are now 40 plus high-quality magnet schools are the result of pressure that was put on it by the Sheff case. The increased number of students, not nearly as many as would like, but who participate in the choice program, are the result of the pressure. And because I do want there to be questions, and I certainly want everyone else to have a chance to speak, let me answer the second question that was asked to Mr. Cotto by Mr. Robinson. How would I feel as a parent if my child didn't get into a magnet school? I would be outraged. I would be outraged if my child didn't get into a magnet school. But I wouldn't be outraged at the magnet school. I wouldn't be mad at the thing that has changed educational opportunities. I wouldn't be mad at the thing that made schools diverse and successful educationally. I would be mad at the state of Connecticut, which has been under order for 22 years to address segregation. I would be mad that they have a model that works, and they have not made opportunities available to all children. I would be mad on behalf of the 53% of Hartford resident minority students who don't have the opportunity when they know how to give it, when they've been ordered by the highest court in the state and saying that that is the right of those students. That's who I'd be mad at. And the solution I'd be looking for would not be to close these schools. It would not be to change the things that make them successful. It would not be to kill the goose that laid that golden educational egg. It would be to increase the opportunities that are available. And that's why we're here today.
So I'd love to hear a little bit, you mentioned, Dennis, about what was the world, right, before the case. And I think it would be great, Elizabeth, to hear from you. You know, take us back to 1989. What were schools like? What were they like for you and for your son? And how have they changed? And how have they not changed?
Well, you know, I think we need to first clarify. It wasn't that I woke up one morning and said, gee, I have nothing else to do. I think I'll still stay in Connecticut. That was not the case. You know, my experience with my children was normal, quote, from what I was exposed to. All right, my kids went to school, and yes, you know, there were old textbooks and all of those things that they talk about till today. But my kids had a normal experience. I mean, I was a very involved parent, so I was in that classroom all the time. As a matter of fact, I have been blessed with with having a profession that would allow me to just leave out and go check in, which scared both the teachers and my children. Right? But I would just go and see what was happening. So, you know, on occasion, Milo, which mostly Milo, not my daughter, Tanya, who's older, but Milo would act out a little bit and we'd have to straighten that out. Or the teacher would do something that I felt was inappropriate and we would straighten that out. But what caught my eye in 1989 was a meeting that I attended. By the way, I wasn't asked to attend the meeting. Someone else was requested to go. She did not want to go because she was a little bit afraid of political ramifications. So she said to me, would you go and take notes? And so I've been taking notes for 30 years now. But when I was in that meeting, I learned that in 1989, 74% of students in Hartford's 8th grade needed assistance with remedial reading. 74% of the students in 8th grade could not read. So for me, that wasn't 74% of the students are failing. To me, that meant the system was failing 74% of our kids. So being a social justice activist, that struck me as, oh no, we have to do something about this. We cannot let this ride. I went back home and spoke to Milo, poor Milo. By the time he was 10, you know, I mean, I drug him to community meetings, marches on Washington, candlelight. He probably thought that's what every kid does after school every day, go to a vigil. So Milo actually went with me to the next meeting that was held, and it was Milo's decision to join the lawsuit. So he would tell you today that when he did that, he was figuring it would be like Judge Judy, like 30 minutes, get it done, move on, not 30 years. So, but that one statistic struck me so deeply that I began to look at other things that were out of my wheelhouse because I was not paying attention. And I believe that that's what the problem is that we, as adults, we do not pay enough attention to what we are presenting as experiences for our youth and how that what we lack to do for them affects them and us in the long run. So I didn't have any idea that things were as bad as they were in 1989, but I quickly found out. And I committed to addressing that, and so that's why I'm here today.
Thank you. I'd actually love to, Dennis, can I ask you one more question? Because I think you were talking so passionately about how mad you would be as a parent, and that killing the goose that laid the golden egg. But I want to dig in a little bit. What is the golden egg? Like, what's working? What is it about integration and integrating the Hartford schools and the magnet school? What is it that is this educational opportunity? And how is the research supporting what is happening?
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that we have been pushing for as the plaintiffs is that there should be more research and that there should be efforts to publicize the good news, because you don't see that here. And it's frustrating for us because we know from the limited research that's been done that the outcomes, these schools are among the best in the state and often in the country, and create opportunities that particularly students of color in Hartford don't have. The outcomes from graduation rates to college going rates to test scores are all higher in these schools. So they're successful. And I think that's one of the frustrations for us. And part of the reason is because of the fact that they are more diverse schools, both racially and ethnically and economically, which is an important part of why this case was brought in the first place.
Yeah.
And so the threat that these opportunities may be destroyed because not everyone can get into them is frustrating. It would be like you develop a cure for cancer and because you only made it available to some people, then you should stop, get rid of the cure rather than say, how can we reach everyone else? And so, those are the things that we are concerned about. There are studies that show they are effective, and there are other studies, not in Hartford, but in general. There is this mistaken idea that the Sheff schools have been a drain on the budget and that they are diverting funds from other schools, and that Sheff is the cause of problems that other schools are having, which, given the history that Elizabeth talked about, is absolutely insane. What has happened is you had a system that had a large number of schools that were not adequate, and you've added 42 or 43 schools that have become more than adequate. And so to blame them for the failure of the other schools is just wrong. The other final thing that I would say, and I'm sorry about going on this long, but there have been studies, not in Hartford, but in other places, that seek to show what the interventions are that are most successful. And what they do is they compare what happens when you add $2,000 per student to a school, or whether you create a school that is racially and ethnically diverse. And the fact is, the racially and ethnically diverse schools have better outcomes than the ones where just money is added. Money is important, and that was one of the problems with the Hartford schools. I would never deny that, but it's only part of the equation. And the things that are the benefits that derive from integrated, diverse schools are benefits not just for Black and Latino students and other students of color, but for all students. And in order to have that happen, you have to have the students in the school. And $2,000 a year is not going to replace that.
I want to just follow up on that because I think Dennis makes a very, very, very good point in that he mentions the notion of who is segregated. In most American minds, when you say segregation, you're really referring to children who are Black and brown. However, the reality is that white children who are stuck in a box with all white children are just as segregated and experience the same negative outcomes in life than children who are of color. So we need to recognize the fact that this is a problem for us. It's not a them and them, it's us. So it's very important to keep that in mind.
Well, this is great because I'd love to go to Robert to kind of talk a little bit more about this, but I think a lot of us, when we were doing our introductions, were talking about, what it means for society to have this segregation, what it means for our democracy to have this segregation. And I think what it means when you're right, when we talk about segregating white students with each other, that there's a real loss there in terms of how we build the critical thinking, the kind of reducing racial bias, all that has been shown around integrated schools. And we have to acknowledge that there's been, inequities that have long tracked with race, right? And so there's also a factor of racial justice in this work to make sure that we're restoring the harms. And I think, Robert, you were talking really interestingly about the role that kind of bringing people into a shared community and belonging to each other and having a kind of commitment to each other by virtue of having a commitment to their own kids. And I wonder for you how you see that playing out, and especially how this intersects with, Dennis mentioned there's good news and the good news isn't being spread. What is some of the misinformation that you see out there, or the terms that people maybe get caught on or are being told mean different things than they do? Lottery, quotas. Like what is the misconception that is preventing us from getting to that place where people can really belong to each other?
All right, that's a lot.
I got 1 minute, go.
But no, I mean, I think, let me put it like, before Sheff and where we're at now, right? So before the Sheff case, you had a racially segregated school system by town and city, by school. The state of Connecticut actually had plans sitting somewhere that said, we're gonna do voluntary desegregation. And it sat there for 10 years until the Sheff case made the state implement the plan. So today, let's look at today, right? We have racially diverse schools. I don't know what the number is, 30, 40 schools in the Hartford area, maybe 60 or 70 magnet schools in all of Connecticut, maybe a couple more, give or take. And that, this is like a stunning accomplishment in terms of bringing people together across town lines, across racial and ethnic groups. It's stunning. I mean, if you think about it from where we were 25 years ago, this is an amazing accomplishment. I think in terms of now, what I see is it's a stunning accomplishment in terms of numerical desegregation. We've gotten kids together and brought people together, and we can count how many people are together, right? But I think part of the problem now, and kind of Dennis talked about this, is in terms of explaining what are the accomplishments. Yes, I think that would be one of my recommendations. We need a better way of sharing what the accomplishments are, what's going on in these schools. Just as a quick aside, every Sheff magnet school should have a plaque that says, here's why this school exists.
Yes.
And on the website as well. If you look at the websites of the magnet schools, they don't have any information about Sheff and desegregation, et cetera. But I think if we look today, what I'm concerned about in terms of school desegregation is that it's been so much focused on the racial balance, and that's almost what the Robinson case is all about, the racial balance, the numbers, how many kids, the lottery, who's there. And we kind of lost focus, I think, in terms of integration and the equal status of people of different races, particularly Black and Latino students who tend to be, come into the space with a number of, there's stereotypes, there's prejudices, but also structurally less power within that space. And what's happened is, and I'm gonna blame the state and to some extent the Hartford Board of Education, is that we've gotten kids into these spaces, right? But then how we do it and what happens when they're there has been completely overlooked in many cases. So let me give you a few instances. And I'm not blaming Sheff, I'm blaming the state and the Hartford Board of Ed. We have instances in which kids are coming into pre-K, right? So the state says, we'll do pre-kindergarten. And then more than half the people in the pre-K are from the suburbs. And then they say, oh, this is an integrated space, right? Or numerically desegregated space, more accurately. There's examples in which, down the street from my house, the Batchelder School was taken, stolen, dispossessed by the Hartford Board of Ed in the state of Connecticut and given to the Montessori Magnet School in order to meet Sheff desegregation goals. Do I blame Sheff? No, I blame the state and the Hartford Board of Education for saying we're gonna do everything at all costs to take a Black and Latino school and give it to another community to make the numbers, right? Nobody in Sheff would have agreed with that. And I'll give you an example. I sat with Pedro Bermudez, who was on the original Sheff plaintiff, and he was sitting in the meeting with the Batchelder parents, and he said, "This isn't what I wanted when I signed up to be a plaintiff in the Sheff case, to take a Latino school and to give it away to make it a magnet school." Okay, so we've got kids in spaces. We're doing the numerical thing, right? But are we attending to the integration part, the treating people in equal status and making sure that we're doing the right thing by kids and parents as well? So let me just quickly give you another example. I'm not saying we shouldn't do magnet schools. I'm not saying that we shouldn't do racial balance. I'm saying the emphasis needs to be more on the qualitative aspects of what's happening in the schools, and not so much of a discussion about how many kids or what the racial balance is. We'll let the lawyers sort that out, right? We'll let the statisticians sort that out, and the people in the back rooms of the State Department of Ed. So I'll just wrap up with just a quick story in terms of in a recommendation. I mean, if you were to ask me, this to put it on my right now hat, practitioner, someone that's involved with magnet schools, the things that we really need to think about in terms of what's going on in these magnet schools is, are we supporting the positive racial development of Black and Latino students in magnet schools? Is that happening? Maybe it is, maybe it isn't. Maybe it's kind of happens sometimes or not. Are we supporting multicultural education, multilingual education? We have 40 magnet schools, none of which are dedicated to bilingualism, particularly in a Spanish-speaking community in which almost 60% of the kids are Puerto Rican and Latino in this district. And there's no dual language program, there's no dual language magnet school, but we have 50 Montessoris, right? Or something, right? We got a whole bunch of Montessoris. Okay, that's cool, but I want my kid to be bilingual. I don't care about Montessori, right? So that's another thing. And I want to wrap up with just a really tragic thing is that, again, are we considering what's happening in these spaces? They're numerically desegregated, they're racially diverse, but are we thinking about what's happening in the spaces? A story from a magnet school recently that I heard, I witnessed it. Students in some of these magnet schools are not being treated correctly, and in one case, students were told they could not speak Spanish. Puerto Rican Latino students, they were not told not to speak Spanish in school, right? So Dennis Parker can say we have 50 magnet schools. Yes, I agree with him. That's fantastic. But on the ground experience of kids in these schools is something that we're not looking at. We're not saying, are these affirming places, so that at the end of the day, when we go to the legislature and we say, we need more magnet schools, right? And then people say, okay, fine, whatever. No one shows up. There's only a few people that show up. Why are they not showing up? Well, maybe because the spaces aren't affirming, right? So that's what I'm gonna leave it. We can talk a little bit more about that, but
This is so
that's
great.
where I'm at.
Wait, I need to respond to that. I really appreciate the work that Robert does, but I think that half of information is only half the information, right? So let's take point by point. Batchelder in Montessori, there was an offer to move the Montessori to a different space that was rejected, all right? So you need to know that there was a very nice campus offered to the parents, and politics and personal got in the way, and that's how come they ended up at Batchelder. Bilingualism, no dual language school. We have in the Sheff movement and the lawyers for years and years and years tried to get the state of Connecticut to open up a dual language school, right? And we will continue to press upon that. Culture in magnet school is a very important question. However, what we're facing is that because the state continues to decrease funding for magnet schools, support such as those things that help build culture in the schools have been cut in lieu of cutting teachers. So, I understand all of these things, and we support corrections of all of these things. I just want to make sure that when you get part of the information, you get the other half as well.
Elizabeth, I want to agree with you wholeheartedly. I want to say just really quickly is that I want to agree with, what she said is 100% accurate, okay? What I want to say is that as a researcher and as someone that has shared space with people in these spaces, right? Magnet schools or non-magnet schools or whatever, working with Batchelder parents and stuff like that. I agree with you. And the problem is that when I get into these spaces and they say, well, gee, why is this Montessori magnet school taking our school? And people aren't seeing the state or the Hartford Board of Ed or whatever. They're saying Elizabeth Horton Sheff did this. And I have to say to them, I say, I know Elizabeth, we're Facebook friends. I'm pretty sure that Elizabeth Horton Sheff didn't say, take this school and make it a back. So I think that's the dilemma is that when we're talking about like the racial balance and this stuff like that, all that factual stuff and all that who's to blame and what's going on gets lost. And I guess that's what I'm saying is like I often have to defend people and say, no, like I know Elizabeth. I'm pretty sure like, she's not the reason that this school won't serve chocolate milk or this school doesn't have books or whatever. But I think that's what I'm trying to say is like, with poor implementation and inattention to what like a two-way integration looks like, everyone says blame Elizabeth, and I disagree with that, and I just want to point that out.
Well, I think what's so great is we're really talking about a journey of trying to rectify centuries of problems, right? And so if we would imagine in 30 years we would have arrived at the end, we would be foolish. So it's really about looking at this as a systemic shift, which requires many policy components. And I think the urge to keep, making sure that more integrated spaces are available. But I think what Robert's touching on so deeply is that integration is far more than desegregation.
Yes.
And I'd like to really turn it over to Franzi because he was snapping a lot while you were talking, so I feel like it's the right time to talk about, at Integrate NYC, how do we look at what integration means? How is that distinct from desegregation? And, how did we get to that definition?
Yes. Thank you. So yes, a lot of great points were brought up earlier as to how integration is more than just the movement of bodies. And at Integrate NYC, where we value voice, the youth have come up with a definition of what integration actually is. And we have something called real integration. And what real integration is that it consists of what we call the 5 R's, a platform that describes what real integration is far more than just the movement of bodies. So, of course, the most visible component of integration is race and enrollment, right? Who comes into schools, what the faces in the schools look like. But we have 4 other pillars of integration that include resource allocation, what's in what school, and what schools have certain things. And the schools that have certain opportunities and resources, what do those schools look like? Mm-hmm. We have something called the 3rd R, which is relationships across group identities. I think that's what Robert was bringing up a lot, and how you have these different groups in schools, but how are they interacting? Is the education that they're receiving culturally responsive and reflective of their identities? Are the students in the classrooms engaging with each other and learning from each other? Or are they just having different separate communities within the same school? The 4th pillar we have is restorative justice. We have a huge issue of Black and brown students being disproportionately suspended and punished, and their relationship with school safety agents, and how they're being funneled into the school prison pipeline, and how that also plays a part in integration. And the 5th R is representation across staff, and the impact that having a diverse school teaching staff in schools and how that affects students. And these are all 5 different pillars that students themselves have voiced across the years at Integrate. We started off with 3 R's, and eventually we built to a 4th and 5th R because we recognize that students would know what's best for an integrated school, and these are all components that students have voiced are what make up integration. So when we use the phrase real integration, we recognize that it's not just the movement of bodies, but pedagogy as well, resources, opportunities, how students deal with school safety agents, and the type of students and the type of leaders that schools have. And we believe this is a holistic approach that we should adopt in terms of what integration looks like. And all this has come from not myself, but student leaders across the city, and I believe that's something that we should definitely look into.
Amen.
A response really quick, and then I just want to make sure that we get to hear from Sasha as well.
Sure. Oh, sure.
So I just want to say, I think we're actually covering 2 things here. We're covering this notion of the value of integration, and both in schools, and I would say we should expand that to neighborhoods.
Yeah, exactly.
And then we're talking about once that happens, how do you make it work well? So I just want to flag that because I think they're both important, and I think one pitch that I want to make later is that people who care about equity and who are focused on school equity need to care about the neighborhood piece.
Yeah.
Because that's a path. But within all of that, we need to worry about how do you do it well, no matter where.
Yeah, and especially thinking about for whom it has not been done well, and making sure that's who we're thinking about first, right? And making sure that that's who we're centering in the question of what would it look like to be done well. And I think that's what, Robert, from these stories are telling us, that there are lived experiences that we really need to get close to and center those voices in the creation of what's next. And to do that, in part, I'm going to turn it over to Sasha. So you said you're a parent, right? Is your daughter 10?
She's 10.
She's 10. Great. So you chose a magnet school for her, and I'm wondering, why? And how has that experience been for you, for her, for your family? And this question of this beyond just desegregation, but to the deeper experience of integration, what has that been like for you and for her?
My school was pretty homogenous. It was pretty white. I'd say it was 99% white, 1% other. And with the other being, I don't know, everything. I don't know. It was pretty other. We'll just say that. And when I was deciding for a school for Kaylani, it was really important that the school be diverse, extremely academically focused, but also fun. So when I was deciding to go through this lottery system, because I was working at a community organization, and I was organizing parents, and somebody's like, you should just, do this magnet school thing. And I was just like, all right, I'm gonna go and do the schools. I had my book. I was writing down all these facts about each school. And the first school that I went to visit was University of Hartford Magnet School. One of my first stipulations was the school had to offer Spanish. Because I was like, they're young, their brains are sponges, and so they'll be able to learn languages easy. And unfortunately, University of Hartford Magnet didn't start teaching Spanish until 5th grade, so it went off the list. And then I was learning about this Discovery Academy, and it was a brand new school. I was like, well, there's no building to work at. Why am I going to go there? They're going to be this little temporary location, and I was just like, I don't know about this one. But Dr. Toker was going to be the principal, and we met at the temporary location, I believe, and she was phenomenal. Like, I just fell in love with her personality, and I was in love with the STEM theme, right? So I was like, science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. This sounds good. My daughter is super, outgoing, and she loved to dance, and I was just like, well, maybe I should send her to a performing arts school. And then I was like, well, I can always take her to dance, but I can't teach her science stuff. I don't know that stuff very well. So I decided to apply for the lottery, and at the time I was living in Hartford, and understanding that half the slots go to Hartford students, half the slots go to suburban, greater Hartford students. And so I was just praying. I think I had my mom's prayer warriors, half the church, and anyone else that I needed to have to ask for, praying that she got in. And she did. So we've been at Discovery since she was in pre-K 3, and she's only known that school. The school is phenomenal. When they finally went to their building, the building is state-of-the-art. Her school is bigger than my high school and has amazing amenities. She's got a 3D printer lab. They have such great things that I'm just like, every kid should have access to these things. they program robots. She's 10. Like, she knows how to program code. I don't even know what code means. And so when she was 2, she would come home talking about primary colors and saying there's a rainbow. She knew what a cumulus cloud was. And I just can't imagine what it would be like if you could say every kid could come home knowing what these things are. And it made me more determined to say that if we could have every school be like a Discovery Academy in the state of Connecticut, if we could imagine what our state would be like. And if every state in the country could be like, could you imagine what the United States could be like? Yeah. And so when you have the opportunity to make that change happen, why aren't we? And as a parent, to see your child so happy to be in a school where she wakes up every day and she wants to go to school, and she's not like, oh, I'm bored, I don't like it. It's, oh, I gotta go. And you have birthday parties and her friends are coming from not only the Hartfords and the East Hartfords, but they're coming from the Avons and the Farmingtons and the West Hartfords. She has friends from everywhere, from all walks of life. And her school does cultural nights where you bring dishes and everyone comes dressed in the traditional garbs, and they have to do posters preparing for it. And it's all inclusive and all encompassing. To have that as an opportunity is just, it's beautiful. And so I want to see more of that. And so I hope that answered your question.
But does she study Spanish?
She did. She did get to study Spanish until they cut the Spanish teacher.
Yeah, the cuts.
But I think exactly what you just said is what I'd love to just kind of open back up to the panel and maybe connect to what Erin was saying is if we do want to see more of this, and if we do want to see more of a truly integrated Hartford and an integrated greater Hartford and an integrated Connecticut and an integrated world, right? What does it look like? What do we need to make it happen? What do we need? And I'm going to turn it back over to Erin because I feel like you were ready to go already.
I mean, I can, if I can have, I don't know if we can switch back, but I could show, I mean, we have particular policies, but I think one piece of this that I didn't mention when I talked about the history was the state's own investment in subsidized housing. I mean, we invest, as the state of Connecticut, both our tax dollars at the state level and through federal assistance, millions and millions and millions of dollars. And we do it in a way that fosters segregation right now.
Yep.
Again and again and again. I'm doing a lot of work right now in the Clay Arsenal neighborhood in Hartford. In Clay Arsenal, 54% of the housing units are subsidized. And that doesn't count families who have tenant-based Section 8. So I suspect that it might be closer to 70 or 80%. And that's not sustainable. That doesn't lead to strong schools. That doesn't lead to sustainable neighborhoods. It doesn't lead to conditions for children that allow them to thrive. I don't know, are you able to switch back over?
Unfortunately,
no. Okay.
not so easily.
Okay, well, so the things that we can do in terms of, so we need to think about both this idea of making sure that our mindset is one of integration and not letting the fact that there can be hard parts of integration stop us from doing that. There'll be all kinds of fixes that need to happen, the kinds of things that Robert was talking about. But I've been in so many conversations with people who go straight to that rather than thinking about the value of integration itself. And in addition, sort of on top of the benefits of school integration that we've talked about, there have been an increasing number of studies recently that show, and a lot of it is about income integration, that when you have that happen, when you have low-income families get access to the resources of mixed-income neighborhoods, you see drastic changes in things like their income, things like whether they go to college and what schools they attend, things like whether they're in stable relationships and whether they are teen mothers, whether they are healthy. I mean, there's such an additional wealth of research that shows that there are other life outcomes in addition to this education stuff that matters. So we have a set of policy recommendations. I put out a bunch over there. I'll have to remember them all because they were all on my slides. There are 6. I'm not going to remember them all. But we are part of a legislative task force that is chaired by the Commissioner of the Department of Housing and Representative Roland Lamar from New Haven. And a lot of these are coming out of the work of that working group. But they include things like, let's actually make sure that the state, which is overseeing zoning and has laws about how zoning needs to be, including laws that say there has to be room in every town for multifamily and affordable housing, that you can't get state money unless you're doing that, right? I mean, that's like, be a team player with the state. We'll help you out and give you money for roads and whatever, but you need to actually do this thing that we say you need to do and be part of Team Connecticut. You know? So there are things like housing authorities. This is really down in the weeds, but housing authorities, they do things like develop affordable housing, they place project-based Section 8, they administer tenant-based Section 8. State law defines housing authorities by the borders of the town that they're in. Most of the families on Section 8 live in Hartford, New Haven, and Bridgeport. So if you were defined by your town, by your housing authority's jurisdiction of the town, there's a disincentive for housing authorities to even let people know on their Section 8 program about housing elsewhere, because they lose money if anyone leaves their town. They're not allowed to project base outside of their jurisdiction, and they're not allowed to build outside of their jurisdiction. So we have like a whole thing, the whole structure of housing authorities that is leading to segregation and is sort of built on this premise about only going town by town in terms of housing. There's data. Like, we don't have good data on where our subsidized housing is, how many units are in different buildings, how many building units have 2 and 3 bedrooms. There's just like a whole wealth of things. We can't even do housing planning or even look at how segregated we are, the segregated system we're investing in, if we don't have this like basic transparency on housing data. So those are just 3 of them, but we have a whole bunch of things that we could be doing.
So how do we change that? How can we change that?
Help us. We're going to have this legislative agenda this year, and we need people to support it. We'd love to come talk to your community about these various proposals, about these issues, and we need a whole campaign around it.
And I think that as Robert noted, that there are pieces that and Erin noted, there are pieces that are missing in our advocacy. We never once said that Sheff is the magic wand. Mm-hmm. If that was the case, we would have did the Judge Judy like 30 years ago, 30 minutes, we got it going. But when you look at the pieces that relate to the pieces, when we talk about housing, we need to talk about transportation. Because in our state, if you do not have transportation, after a certain hours when the buses stop running, you are stuck where you are. Unless you got Uber Cash, Lyft Cash. We need to talk about job opportunities, employment opportunities where people live, so employment opportunities in the suburbs. I'm going to be real radical here, and some people do, because, Connecticut functions like 168 sovereign states. We are a postage stamp. I think we could fit in one of the New York boroughs, right? But we act like, that. Now, I would say, that we need a regional school system. That's what we need. We need to get rid of all these town councils, all these school boards, all these superintendents. Since Sheff has been on the board, we've had in Hartford, 14, 15, 16, 17 superintendents, right? 8 or 9 education commissioners. And all that means is that the hamster in the wheel starts running in a different direction with each new superintendent and each new commissioner. So I think we need to look at a regional school system, and I want to support what Erin is saying. This is an all hands on deck situation. We need to start talking about advocacy across the board for justice on all fronts.
If I could just piggyback on that, the successes of the past 22 years come from that regionalism, the fact that it's an amazing opportunity that can be used to create educational opportunities. And one of the things we have been consistently urging is that the problem is when you do look at it as these, 25 different fiefdoms, it prevents you from taking effective steps that could increase educational opportunities. We are continually raising the fact that many of the suburban school districts are losing their student population and are talking about closing buildings. And each one of those buildings is an opportunity that can be used to keep the schools open, but to also create space for both the students in those communities and Hartford students. I have been proposing for a while something that would be the desegregation equivalent of an environmental impact statement. We have no problem with, if we're going to build a building, knowing that you have to do a traffic study, knowing that you have to do something that looks at the impact that it has on the environment. We don't do that for educational decisions to determine upfront what will be the impact on integration, on diversity, on educational opportunities. And we should be doing that. And we should be doing it not just each individual town, but part of a larger system. And so just think of what if every time the state was determining whether or not a school should be closed, they stopped to think, what effect will this have, and what could we do with this space? That is something that could be done
We just passed
quickly.
something like this last year at the legislature. Yeah, I don't know, maybe Rob wants to say something more about it. But
That's great, because I think there's so much more we could talk about, but I really want to respect and honor all of you who came out here to kind of have that shared conversation. So we're going to open it up to questions, and I already see some hands. But I actually I saw someone who I really respect say something that I loved, which is that we are really actually, we're sitting at this table and there's a lot of expertise, there's a lot of commitment, there's a lot of time up here. And you all are part of this community just the same. So in the event that you do want to make a comment and not ask a question, that's okay. But my request is that you actually just keep it very brief so that other people who have want to make a comment or want to ask a question have the opportunity. Okay, so we're just going to be really thoughtful about each other in the way that we either ask a question or make a comment. Great, I see a hand there.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Principal. Thank you so much for being here and thank you for having this. My name is Molly Wheeler. I'm from New Haven and I'm a public school parent. So I think that a piece of this that I'm also part of Integrated Schools, which is a grassroots organization, sort of like created by white people, white privileged people, to Hearts and Minds campaign of anti-racism work. So that's kind of what I want to ask. I feel like a piece that we're missing about this is how white people, that I know you guys think about all the time, I'm sure, but how white people navigate schools, the language that we use about how to navigate schools and strategize our kids throughout the schools. And New Haven's a good example of that. We have magnets. I think most white people don't know what magnets are, why they were started. They love themselves some schools with people of color for the free pre-K. They have no problem driving their kid across another city, but come third grade, they start talking about test scores, even though they opted out of test taking. They talk about the homework isn't rigorous, even though they opted out of homework. So we have all these metrics, and I'm just wondering, how can we? I know how to do this, in my community with my people, right? My white people, and talk about whiteness, whether or not they're ready. And I'm learning a lot. But what do we activate on a higher level in order to do this? Because white people have given up nothing. We talk about regional districts. I would love that, but only if white people were moving their bodies. I don't want people of color to move their bodies anymore until I do something, right? Until I lose more, I being a white person. So I guess I'm just wondering, how does it go above the Hearts and Minds campaign to do the anti-racism and anti-bias work so that we know how we're putting our bodies in schools? And not just, because my kid's in a magnet school that's minority white, the white people suck up all the power. So Anyway, do you understand? Is my question clear?
Yeah, your question is clear. I think you're doing what is the beginning that needs to happen in the beginning. We have to continue to have these conversations. And it is imperative that white people talk to white people about white privilege. Okay. So we really need to keep pushing on that conversation. To get it higher, then you need to start bringing it to the leadership in your towns. So invite your legislators, your mayor, your council people to engage in these kinds of conversations. Because you're right, if it doesn't affect me, I'm not going to be interested in until it does. So you have to make it clear through conversation and through history. I think what we lack in our nation is a knowledge of history. We don't know that the civil rights movement, we don't understand all of the things that happened in this nation to make some movement towards justice. And we don't want to discuss it. We don't want to discuss it because, that was then. We don't want to discuss institutionalized racism like it doesn't exist. You got to keep pushing those buttons. I think you're doing the very right thing.
Hi, my name is Steve Camp. I'm a pastor here in town in Clay Arsenal, Faith Congregational, also a resident of Hartford. My comment, and I guess it's wrapped up in a question as well. I think Aaron was beginning to get at my concern. Let me preface by saying I've known Elizabeth for many years, and I have a great trust in her leadership and her commitment to community. But I think Aaron was beginning to get at the concern I have, and that is that we miss the real conversation too often. For me, the real conversation is about those 21,000 kids who are not part of the magnet system. Those 21,000 children who need a voice and have no voice in all that we are trying to do to integrate. They are left at the sideline while the game is being played. And it's time that we stop that, because children are poor, they get left out. Clay Arsenal is a good example of that. So when we talk about magnet schools, hooray for those kids who are able to get into the lottery. But unless that conversation is about those other kids who can't get in that lottery, we're missing it. And so I would just absolutely say to all of you, as I know Carol was on the board, had a chance to have this conversation with the school board. But unless we're doing it for the 21,000, we're not doing it for any of them, which includes our whole community and all of the problems that we all say that we have to face in our community. There's a question in there, so you can answer it as you want.
Thank you for that question. I think, again, we can split this off. There's sort of the magnet school issue, there's how to help the Hartford public schools that aren't magnet, and then there's also the housing choice part of this. So, and we've been doing surveys in Hartford among families who have Section 8 and RAP. And in the Clay Arsenal area, coming out of the Emmanuel Pugh buildings, we've surveyed the residents there, and this is in partnership with Christian Activities Council. And we found that 61% of the families surveyed actually want to leave Hartford. And, and in other situations, the number's been more like 45%. So I think the Clay Arsenal residents are dealing with intense situations because of the conditions of their building. But if you sort of piece all these things together, if you really had housing options for families who want them elsewhere, which I don't think really is 61% of people living in Hartford, I think it's a lower number than that. If you continue with the magnet program, And you actually would have a smaller number of students in the Hartford Public Schools, but you can intensify resources there.
Yes.
Really intensify, much more than educational funding formulas you're doing right now. So, I mean, you're asking a question about sort of a movement and how you get there, but I think that's a structure that you could fit a movement into.
Yeah, sure. I'll just pass it down. Just really quickly, I wanted to point out this idea of, like, I think I mentioned it earlier about a commitment to quality, high quality schools and effective schools everywhere, right? And I think my interpretation of Sheff, school desegregation before that, has always been this particular case is saying you're going to open up desegregated opportunities to students or create high quality, well-resourced schools. What the state of Connecticut is saying is we don't want either one, right? And so the state of Connecticut is saying, end the magnet thing, we know what to do, when in reality, they're actually reducing educational cost sharing grants in many states and towns. They're actually reducing the ability to have high quality Black and Latino schools and reducing the ability to have high quality racially integrated schools. The state's playing a game here, right? And I think we can have both. And what the state is saying is, let's get rid of the magnet thing and let's get rid of the racial balance thing. And, you know, on the side, we're not going to make sure everyone has what they need. And I think Sheff, what it can be is a way to push the state, because now we don't have CGEF, right? There's no CGEF funding case.
Right.
There's currently no mechanism to push the state of Connecticut to say either or both high quality schools and racially integrated schools. There's nothing there. I think Sheff can play that role there. So just finally, I wanted to point out, in addition to multiculturalism, multilingual education within magnet schools, desegregation cases in the 70s, I don't know about the 60s, but at least in the 70s, would often gather information from people within a town. So for example, in the Lumpkin case, which is in 1970 here in Hartford, Connecticut, the court actually invited people to say, tell me how you feel about the schools. What's going on? What do you need? And I don't see any reason why the Sheff case can't ask the state to say, you give us money to hire someone, a good reputable researcher, to survey people in Hartford in magnet and non-magnet schools to say, what is your experience? Are these schools well-resourced? Are they respectful of your racial and cultural background, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera? We can do that. And I think that needs to be done in order to kind of push the state to do one or both of those two things. High quality schools that have mostly Black and Latino students and or racially integrated schools. Finally, I just wanted to point out one more thing. The state of Connecticut, and this is, again, the game that the state of Connecticut is playing, is that they're saying we don't want racially integrated magnet schools. We don't want to pay for them. They've been cutting funding over the last couple of years. And they've also been cutting funding in the ECS category. To some extent, some of the cities have gotten a little bit more, right? And on the other hand, what they are funding is racially isolated, racially segregated private charter schools, and they've tripled over the last decade in terms of enrollment, okay? Tripled, right? And then secondly, the state is also investing in market rate housing in downtown Hartford.
Market rate.
Market rate, which means that you have to earn $22 an hour at least to afford that housing. Okay? So on the one hand, the state is saying we don't want racially integrated magnet schools. We don't want well-funded Black and Latino schools. But what we do want is racially isolated charter schools and racially isolated market rate housing in a very small part of Hartford, probably like a 1 or 2 mile radius within downtown. That's a game that's being played. So I don't want to just get away from the quality thing, but I want to kind of point out what the game is being played, and what I think Sheff has to transform and maybe add more to the agenda is bring some of these other pieces in, the housing thing and the other thing, and say we need to push more, because right now, without Sheff, what is the pressure or what is the thing that's going to push the state to do more on education and or housing at all?
Nothing.
What's the thing? What's the thing? Robin Artefe Porter, state representative from Bridgeport. It takes a case, it takes help in the legislature, it takes people to actually move things forward.
This is the worst part of my job. It is the worst part of my job, and I should have told you, Rachel, I'm actually really bad at it. But I saw 2 hands. I want to give those people just a moment, very briefly, to say, just in quick succession, and then we're gonna let one quick response, maybe two. I wanna respect y'all's time, but we could really keep talking about it. Come up to us afterwards. Okay, question over here, and then back there.
Yeah, so the question I had was, and I think it hits on what Robert was kind of going to, is what responsibility does the Sheff movement have to, number one, rebrand and as existing to forward racial justice and kind of help the country become like an actual democracy? And then two, what responsibility does Sheff have to stand and work in solidarity, mobilize with neighborhood schools to reimagine more equitable distribution of resources that actualizes the commitment to magnets being a way to get a really great education and not the only way. Okay, so one, rebranding for racial justice, and then two, standing in solidarity and working with neighborhood schools to mobilize so that everyone get the education that they deserve.
Okay, great question. Back here. Worst part of my job. So stressful.
Gosh, I wish I went first now because your questions are so good. My name is Bobby Jowath and I'm a school counselor at the Academy of Aerospace. I'm also a PhD student at UConn Nyesha School. Heads up to you guys. But what you, sir, said something about really bringing the multicultural bilingual education into the magnet schools. We brought the numbers together, and what I'm seeing in my magnet school, we're here, but we're not all taking the same classes, we're not all treated the same still. And when I'm in my class, I'm taking a class right now, Multicultural Education by Danielle Philippia, and it's not a required course in the teacher prep program. It's a great course, and those students are dying for more. So they have worked so hard on creating who they are as white people with the one brown student who's in the class. And they want more, but there's not another class that they have to take, and it's not even a required class. So when we talk about making sure that the teachers are ready to serve these students in magnet schools and serve these students in culturally diverse ways, I think looking to our universities and making sure that they're preparing our teachers for this. At Craig, where'd she go? Well, Olivia Hussey and I, we ran a session this year where we talked about Sheff and the new teacher prep. It was the first time Craig ever did that. We've hired teachers, but we don't talk about why and who we are and what we do. And I think that has created, for some of us, a space where not everybody's voice is as important, right, or is heard. So we're working to dismantle that, but I think if we could reach out to those higher education institutions and get them to really, really buy into preparing our teachers, our workforce for multicultural education, because it doesn't just matter for magnet schools or for Hartford or Newport Inn or wherever, it matters for Avon and Canton and Glastonbury, right? Yes. So that's just my comment. If there's any way we could move into MEAG or to CCSU, it'd be great.
Great. So I'm gonna bring those themes together with what does it look like to continue an anti-racist movement? And I'm gonna give you all 1 second to respond to that. Which deserves a whole other.
Kind of hard to do it in a second in response to your questions. We don't feel Sheff has to be rebranded because the things you asked have always been a part of the case. And one of the things that I would recommend to you and to everyone here, and Rachel, wherever you are, I don't know whether the first thing the Sheff plaintiffs did after the victory in 1996 was to create a system of principles and guidelines that talked about all of those things, that talked about the need to not just, the Sheff is not about creating magnet schools. It's about creating educational opportunities and doing as many of that, and by whatever means that we have to do that. We are committed to that. We have always urged the need to look at neighborhood schools, to find a way to make them part of a solution that assures that every student gets the most opportunities possible. So that's not something that's new. That's not something that is foreign. The other thing though is that we think we never discussed it as a question of educational quality and diversity. We think that they are one concept, and we want to make sure that everyone has an opportunity for it.
Maybe rebrand is the wrong word, remessage, so that people know that, because no one knows.
Right.
They don't know that, so it doesn't matter.
We need to work on that.
Right.
And I thank the Sheff movement for its role in getting things out. Lawyers are not always good at that, and it's good to have someone else working on it.
And what I'll say is, I think going to this conversation of what is this work about? Why does integration matter? There's a quote that I often kind of go back to in thinking about not just what the goal is, but also how we get to that goal. Shortly before his assassination, Martin Luther King was interviewed, and this is kind of the quote in condensed version. We talked of integration in romantic and aesthetic terms, and it ended up adding color to a predominantly white power structure. What is necessary now is to see integration in terms of political sharing of power. We don't want to be integrated out of power, we want to be integrated into power. And this is really a question about how do we actually create this transformation in a way that restructures a predominantly white power structure and starts to really value all of our citizens. With that, I have to say, there's a lot that Alyssa said this before, this is not like a spectator sport. It's time to get involved, right? So we want to just share with you some opportunities for what you could do. Rachel mentioned at the beginning, we're going to be having a workshop today. If you want to join us and you happen to have the Saturday, we'd love to be working with you to talk about equity, to talk about how we particularly center students in the work of engaging their own schools and schools in their communities. You can write letters to policymakers about these issues, shout out to policymakers, but also, there's a lot who aren't taking action, and this is an opportunity for you to make your voices heard in that way. There are monthly meetings of the Sheff Movement Coalition. Come through. You can join the Legislative Agenda Committee. So this is really the question of what are we doing in the law?